I say that, emotions don't produce themselves. They come from sentences in our mind. And if we believe a bunch of lies, it's going to produce a whole lot of negative emotional energy that's not right.
Hello and welcome to Center for Victory's podcast of Your Best Day Yet. It's Center for Victory. We're here to help unlock, reinforce, and enrich relationships through personal to professional development. I'm Eric Guy, Chief Victory Officer here at the Center for Victory. With us today from Texas is Dr. Greg Stewart. He's currently a full-time telehealth counselor, executive coach, and consultant. I can't wait to dig into some of his stuff, though. He has a BA in organizational leadership, master's in divinity, MA in counseling, PhD in counselor education and supervision. And his dissertation was the relationship of emotional intelligence to job satisfaction and organizational commitment. That actually sounds interesting for a dissertation. And we're going to unpack a couple of his books, I Cubed, Unlocking the Inner Strength Behind Your Negative Emotions, and I Cubed for Couples, Facing Our Negative Emotions to Build Intimacy in Marriage. Welcome, Greg. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you, sir. Hey, my pleasure. It's my honor to be here, Eric. Thank you.
Yeah, and so we got a lot to unpack here. Tell us a little bit about your background, and I think that'll make sense. We usually always do that with guests, but your background and what got you to what you're doing today, because it's very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to start super early, but don't worry, it's going to go fast.
Okay,
So
gotcha.
from Michigan originally, and when I was a kid, like a lot of us, went to junior church, and that's when I accepted Jesus as my Savior as a kid. And then my parents were going to church, which meant, of course, I could go to church, and I did the whole party hardy teen years, and then suffer the consequences from those years, and then recommitted life to Christ. And I actually landed back at the very same church I accepted Christ as a kid. So that was my church. Matter of fact, that's where I became a pastor for 15 years. But so when I came back, I felt like on fire and I felt called into the ministry. So I spent a summer in South America on a missions trip, and then I came back and did a year at a Bible Institute in upstate New York. And then when I was doing my internship at the church from my Bible Institute, the senior pastor asked me to be the youth pastor. So I started as a youth pastor. Well, back in the 90s, it was the times in which they started the adult and continuing ed programs for all of us who had like 160 credit hours but no degree. So the ones that Cornerstone University in Grand Rapids, Michigan offered was in organizational leadership. So I thought, cool. So it was like take a class Thursday nights for 1 year, you get your degree. But that was great, good material. But I wanted to get onto seminary, right? Because I was, the Greek, Hebrew theology. So in my first semester of seminary, I took philosophy of counseling, and it was one of those defining moments of like being called to ministry. Like this material is incredible, because I can see how it can be used in ministry, but also realized, of course, how many issues I had. So love the material. So I immediately mapped out a dual master's. So I got my MDiv in 3 years and graduated in 2000, got ordained. But during that same year, because I went on to get my MA in counseling, another perfect storm happened where I was on vacation and I came across the book Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman, like a lot of us
Yes,
have.
yes, yes, yes.
Then I started teaching in all as an adjunct professor for my alma mater in all of the organizational leadership courses I took in my undergrad, and I fell in love with leadership. And at the same time, I was actually underneath a senior pastor who loved the Lord, moral man, but I could just tell he had a lot of emotional stuff going on, right? So they eventually asked him to leave. I became the senior pastor. Then when I was a senior pastor, I went on to get my PhD from Regent University in counselor ed and supervision. So that was kind of, you can see it play out into how I got my dissertation, EI relates to job satisfaction, organizational commitment. So I finished that church, had a great experience, was at the church for 15 years. That I became a Christian as a kid. And then we eventually moved down to Texas, and I got a job for 3 years at an organizational assessments company and flew around the country doing senior leadership team seminars and coaching executives on all this stuff that I became part of. Well, the company got bought out, and then 80% of us got laid off. So if you've never had the opportunity to get laid off, it's awesome. You got to try it, right? So hopped around, eventually landed at the residential treatment center for teenagers. So I've had a wide array of things. So what I conclude with is, even though I got like these degrees and it was a wonderful experience, what I talk about in my first book is in 2011, my marriage wasn't doing well and end up having an emotional affair. And So emotional failure just simply means that I don't do anything physically, but just got too inappropriately connected relationally with a gal. So, but I was a marriage counselor and a pastor, and I just was like, what's going on? So from that experience and the last 10 some odd years of healing was incredibly powerful. And I talk about it in the book, but that's what I had to figure out. And that's what kind of led to the 3 books that I just finished in the last year of walking into our negative emotions.
Yeah. And in your book, I cubed, unlocking the inner strength behind your negative emotions. It seems like a lot of us helpers, I see that a lot. Like I've seen what you talk about, a whole lot, whether it be counselors, pastors, teachers, therapists, whatever. We just get to a point, I think, where we get burnout and the emotions get the better of us, and then we fall. We
Hmm.
fall. It's easier to fall prey to those things. I'm not
Yeah. Yeah.
justifying them. I'm just
Yeah. Right. Right.
it happens,
Hmm.
right? So what's this book about? Because it sounds really interesting, and I have not read it yet.
Yeah, right. That's fine. All right. So the first one, all three, I just, it kind of just stumbled upon the whole I Keep series, but so that it has to do with unlocking the inner strength behind our negative emotions. And simply that, let me just briefly say that. So everything we do is trying to achieve an emotional goal. We want to feel something. So I say there's micro emotional goals, like I'm thirsty. I don't want to feel thirsty, right? But it's about the macro emotional goals. So our pursuing micro emotional goals, the macro emotional goals are there, which is quality of life as evidenced by our standard of living and living our values and fulfilling destiny, calling, and purpose. So that's our all the emotional goals for us are good. The issue is we have to separate those goals from the path and assess the path we take to achieve the emotional goals. And I use rational, healthy, wise, and right, RHWR, all the way throughout the book. Let's say, for instance, if I don't want to feel stress, but I choose the path of drinking alcohol every night, right? I achieve the emotional goal, but it's not a rational, healthy, wise, and right path, right? So that's one. Secondly, where we go into a deeper dive, as I like to explain it, where behind us is the house of our heart, right? And I'm standing in front of the house and I have all these people and different things facing me in my heart and I'm guarding it and it's triggering me, right? And there's Eric. So let's say Eric calls me a name. And so, how much emotional energy? So I say number one is emotion is energy, right? We burn it off to assess issues, but there's good emotional energy and negative, not bad. Secondly, is that we have to have the right brand or type of emotional energy. Like people say it's anxiety when it's actually stress and so on. But the key is the right amount. And that's what I wanted to get to. So Eric calls me a name, and on a scale of 1 to 10, like how big of a deal is it? And how much emotional energy do I need to respond to it? So on a 1 to 10, it's like a point 0.5, like big deal. You call me a name, and I need about the same, a point 0.5 to respond to it. But what I find myself at is at a 6, 7, or 8. And I call that the inflation of emotions. And right there is where I have to stop because if I dump a 6, 7, or 8 level of emotional energy on you, it's going to cause more damage instead of just addressing the issue, right? So that's when I say we got to turn around. I got to put down the microscope and quit analyzing Eric. And I got to pick up the mirror because that inflation of emotions is exposing something in me, which is number 3. All negative emotions exposing something in me. So I walk into the house of my heart and I have all these emotions, insecurity, anxiety, fear, worry, anger, depression. But real quick, there's 3 reasons for the inflation of emotions I find with people. One is we simply believe a lie about the situation. It could be about ourselves, like, I'll never get a job. And I say that, emotions don't produce themselves, they come from sentences in our mind. And if we believe a bunch of lies, it's going to produce a whole lot of negative emotional energy that's not, all right? That's the number one reason. Secondly, is the first room is insecurity. And off that room is the door that leads into the basement of the machine of identity, value, and worth. Because when I take it personally, we've heard that phrase before that you call me a name, it's not just it's a point 0.5. I take it personally, which means that negative thing is impacting my identity, value, and worth. Huge. I almost like just begin with a lot of clients there. So in the basement, off in the corner, is that dark, dingy door, cellar door of trauma, both big T and little t trauma, which is the third reason there's that carryover effect from bad past experiences. So that's like the first book where like I talk about just the practicalities of the psychobabble stuff of our mental models and such, but addressing and walking into, so we walk into these negative emotions because of the inflation. Of course, then there's the marriage one, which is the same kind of stuff, but facing our negative emotions to build intimacy. But my leadership book is a complete 180, which we can get into. But that's kind of like the premise of all 3 books.
Yeah, it's interesting that how impactful emotions can be sometimes to us. It's a lot of what, we're speaking the same language here, because a lot of people can get rid of things and do better in life if they just kind of, as you said, walk into those emotions. One of the things that I found with the third thing that you mentioned was that trauma and that
Yep.
carryover effect. Uh, we don't do a good job of walking into that and recreating the storyline for that. Um, if you just focused on that, what are your ideas around that, and how do you help people deal with that piece?
Sure. And so when I worked at, I was a director of a residential treatment center. And for people who aren't aware, a behavioral health hospital, like the acute, is where people are suicidal and they go in and stabilize for 3, 5, 7, 10 days. So if like teenagers have a few, stays at a hospital, but they don't stabilize, they get referred to an RTC
Hmm.
for 6 weeks to 6 months. Well, I was the director, and I was originally got hired as a therapist on the girls unit. And a lot of people say, well, I don't like working with teenage girls because they're so catty and dramatic. I mean, I loved it, right? Love those girls, had a huge heart for them. So I'd go to the girls and I'd say, look, you need to heal from your trauma. But as soon as I said that, Eric, I would follow up with, but you don't need to think about him anymore. Right. So the key is that I asked the question, why is it that an event or something like 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago is still impacting us today if nothing else has happened, let's say, since that event? Well, I say that the reason why they don't have to think about him anymore is because we walk away from any traumatic event, big T, which is like the official diagnosable stuff, and little T trauma, which I mean, few of us have been experienced big T trauma. Everybody has experienced little T trauma, which is it's rocked our world. So we walk away with two things: lies about ourselves, there's the lies again, but also what we lost. And what we lost is something beautiful, like confidence, security, safety. So when we say that people who heal, what does everybody say who heals? I am stronger now than I've ever been. I, of course, wouldn't wish that upon anybody, but I'm stronger now than we've ever been. Well, it's because you reclaim what you lost, and it's like a healing of a broken bone. So, in a nutshell, it's those two things of reclaiming what you lost that actually become stronger, and you reclaim confidence or security or safety or trust. And that's kind of like, in a nutshell, the end state. Like now, paths to get there could be just cognitive behavioral or EMDR or different techniques, but that's the end game, is to reclaim what was lost.
Yeah, and you said reclaim what was lost. I mean, the second piece I think I heard you say was, about the identity, value, and worth, like taking things personally and putting your, think what you were saying was
Yeah,
putting
yeah.
your identity into what somebody says, does, or whatever about you. I'd like you to unpack that as well, that second piece, if you could.
Yeah, for sure. So when I ask people like what their identity is, you know, eventually they just start listing facts about themselves, right? Which is fine. My roles, my accomplishments, my attributes. But the key is that we assign a value and worth to each of those facts, right? So I just simply say divide it up into, does this fact about me increase my value and worth, not impact it, or decrease, right? But then I step back and say, where do we get that formula for our value and worth to begin with? Well, it comes from our parents. And this is like every human being ever, right? So it's unavoidable. Meaning, so I think it's a God design thing. So here's the key: if a child feels pursued, right, unconditional love pursued by his or her parents, which is unconditional love, it's recovery, how to learn how to recover from failure, and it's equipping for success. Then of course there's a good value and worth. But obviously it's a whole spectrum of healthy to unhealthy parenting, and that's why we say a child, they don't have a strong self-worth because they're unhealthy parents. So that what gets added to the formula would be our peers during adolescent years, and then significant others like bosses, teachers, coaches, so on. But eventually kind of culminates with our spouse. So that is every human being ever goes through that experience. The key is that here's the deciding factor: that at some point I say every adult must make the conscious choice to remove every other human being from that formula, right? So I say, I don't need my wife to pursue or validate me. I want her to, I just don't need her to, right? And what that means is it doesn't change the definition of relationship. Like for marriage, it doesn't change the standards, it does not change the expectations. What it changes is the degree of negative impact on me when it doesn't occur. I don't need them. So I say, take that same phrase and now roll it back through everybody, going back to your parents. I don't need my mom and dad to apologize. I don't need them to own it. I want them to because our current relationship is contingent upon whatever. I don't need them to. I want them to. So what does that do? It takes it from I'm no longer devastated, which is inside of me. I'm just disappointed. So I can externalize it and say I'm disappointed. They should have done a better job, but I don't need them to validate, pursue, say I'm sorry, what have you. But then I go
Hmm.
through a process, which I'm going to get into as far as I have a triangle of, okay, so the success of our ability to do that emotionally and feel it emotionally has to do with solidifying our own identity value and worth, which is like creating a strategy for increasing the facts about ourselves and our own view of self along with the Lord and all that. But there's much to get into with that. But that's in a nutshell how we can reclaim our value and worth by removing every other person from that formula.
Yeah, and I would assume that that first piece that you said, which is so crucial, is believing a lie about ourselves, right? And rescripting, like you have to rewrite the story. Like it doesn't
Yep,
have to, when we fall into, especially I think people that, big trauma, little trauma, whatever you want to call it, like those rewrite the scripts. And if we're not aware of that, that story will continue to play out. Like it'll just
very
bury
much.
itself. It comes back. I always say, it comes back uglier than something that than it actually was. And we do that, but that lie about ourselves is huge. And how do you,
Well, I didn't talk about like
what are some
for
tips that you would give people to kind of
right.
rewrite that story?
So at the core of like say for believers that I say that Satan's got one tool, right? He doesn't have a toolbox, he has a holster. Lies. Lies. And those lies come in the form of me, he, we, right? So lies about myself, lies about the Lord, and then lies about a relationship. It's everything starts there. Matter of fact, I always point out like the really old movie now, The Passion of the Christ back in 2004, right? That I say if you watch the opening scene when Satan is there talking to Jesus, if you go back and look at all of the statements he makes, all of the lies he gives are in that form, right?
Yeah.
So that's one. Then secondly, there could be just like again, just psychological lies like I'll never get a job. So I say you have to take that lie, right? There's some truth in it. So the truth is you replace it with a few sentences like, look, if I'm honest with myself, the truth is that I did not try very hard in high school and college, right? So I don't know what kind of job I'm expecting to get, but if I work hard, if I go back to school or learn a trade or just start at a place of work, I can work my way up. So there's hope involved that we have control over it. So it's just replacing the lie of I'll never get a job because our frontal lobe, when we say I'll never get a job again, our mental model doesn't debate. It produces the emotion, right?
Yeah.
So if I say to you that like, Eric says I'm a blank, and then I
Hmm.
believe it because I don't have a lot of security in myself. So there's psychological lies, but then there are the spiritual lies, which lies about myself that, I'm not worthy or I'm unlovable, which lies about God, meaning like he abandoned me, right? Or lies about a relationship like he doesn't care. Again, those lies produce a lot of negative emotion, but there's no solution to a lie, right? And then we see that, of course, all over our culture, society, and world of people responding as if those lies were truth.
Yeah. I think there's and I don't want to get too down a rabbit hole here, but I think there's a lot of utility and value to, what we just say journaling and getting,
Mhm.
trying to rewrite that story for yourself. I mean, it's huge, right?
Yep. And so the story is like making sure that the interpretation, I'll get into the IQ now. So it's okay if I get into like the IQ because it
Yeah,
ties into it,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
I came up with the iCube like 25 years ago, and I've always wanted to write the book on iCube. So I thought it was a cool title because I was a math major in my undergrad. That's where the cubed comes from, right? So it's very hard to remember, right? So I'm not very good for marketing, but I'm sticking with it, right? So I liken the IQ process. Matter of fact, the IQ chapter is at the end of each book because after I go through all the deep dives, here's a summary of how to then just remember to apply the rest of the stuff, right? So I liken it onto the Panama Canal. So the first lock has to fill up before the second lock opens, right? So the first lock is information, right? So the
Okay.
rule is that I hold myself accountable. I came up with this when I was a pastor that it is illegal for me to have any opinion, interpretation, or any emotion, intensity until I have all the information or as much information as possible. Now, imagine, Eric, if everybody in our world applied that one rule. It is illegal for me to have an opinion or any emotion until I have all the information, but it's crucial, right? So once that first lock fills up on the information or as much information as I can, then interpretation is the critical thinking piece. Simply the rule there is, or the question is there any other way of looking at this? Right? So there's negative, neutral, positive. When we always begin with negative, of course, but is there any other way of looking at it? Meaning, if we have like 10 people, would they suggest like, hey, look at it this way? So, and the key is with our minds that we just are so black and white. It's either this or this. No, there could be, I worked with a guy today. There's 6 statements of truth, of interpretation, of the fact that of how to interpret. Like he's dating a gal, she's going to medical school, and he was frustrated. Like he like she says, I've never been in love like this before, which is great, but he feels like he's pursuing her harder than she's pursuing him. So statement of truth is, I am pursuing her. It's truth harder than she's pursuing me. However, she loves and adores me, and right and says right. But number 3 is, and she's also going to medical school. However, she could still, I believe, pursue me harder than she is. And number 3 is that regardless of pursuit, she needs to do a better job at communication. But nevertheless, like what she's doing or not doing is descriptive, not prescriptive. Right. So all those statements are true that he needs to incorporate each time, or else he's going to go down the
Mhm.
emotional black hole. So that's the interpretation, like all the different ways. So you really got to get good at being teachable and debating yourself. Again, you've got to go inside, walk inside versus, put down the microscope, pick up the mirror, and like train your mental model to have critical thinking skills to look at, like, how would God look at this? How would she look? I mean, other people who would debate you. Then what naturally flows from that is the intensity again, which is that emotional energy. What's the most effective response? Kind of like the now what? All right, moving
Mhm.
forward. What do I do? And that's the emotional energy that just kind of flows from the first two. So in that process of stopping and like you said, either journaling, it's I need to like do a sentence dump. Let's say I'm processing the relationship with my wife. And I say every sentence your mental model, just type it up. Don't analyze it yet, just type it all up. Just do a dump. And then go back and make sure that every statement is absolute truth. So if it's not, then delete it and replace it with a sentence or two of truth, right? But where the story, the narrative comes in is kind of like with your identity, value, and worth and the trauma piece in the basement. Like the top in the house, I say like, insecurity is the first room, and then you have anxieties in the kitchen. You have fear that's crouched in the hallway. You have worry looking out the front window, and you got anger in the bedroom, and then you got depression, which is laying in bed, right? So, but the story, those are like day in, day out emotions. But the story is, it's like vision calling destiny, because on my going to my leadership book, a major piece is helping people develop their mission statement always flows from our life experiences. That's when you start getting into our narrative, our story, because the end game is that I am a saint, I'm a priest, I'm a king, right? Get into all the theology of who we are and what God wants to develop us to be. So it's kind of like I say negative 10 to positive 10. So negative 10 to 0 is like counseling, right? The negative emotions, you get to 0. Now we're into coaching, where it's like maximizing who you are. And I put myself on a bell curve, like of being a husband. There's 100 Gregs, and that 100th Greg, percentile Greg, the top one, he's awesome as a husband. So I don't compare him. I mean, it's good to compare yourself with others to get tips, but there is a Greg who is an awesome husband. So that's the writing of the story, and what's keeping me from that is part of the story and overcoming those things.
What did you mean by you help people write mission statements for themselves? Is that what you said? Did I hear that correct?
Yeah. Hmm. So going to the leadership book real quick is so I know there's 3 books here. So
It's
so
all
I
good, dude.
switched it.
All
I
good.
switched it on the leadership book. So the first book subtitle is Unlock the Inner Strength Behind Your Negative Emotions, Walk into them. The couples book is, facing our negative emotions to build intimacy. But the third book, it's like unleash the rage of negative emotions against the obstacles of becoming more. So becoming more is my business. It's an ongoing process.
Mhm.
So that's like chapter 1, just again the psychobabble. Chapter 2 is the becoming more quotient, where I say with when I do with leaders that there's 4 quadrants, and I say if you can find me a book, an article, a quote, proverb, anything on leadership that doesn't fit in one of these 4, I'll buy you lunch. Well, I still have my money. Okay. So first is IQ, right? So we're born with it. We can't do that, but we maximize our IQ through formal and informal education, be a constant learner. But secondly, critical thinking skills. So critical thinking is a skill set that we can learn, like Bloom's taxonomy, different things. But then there's the interplay between personality and EQ, emotional intelligence. So IQ, EQ, personality. Remember, I say that I don't know how you can talk about leadership without addressing personality. Because every time we blow it as leaders, it's because we take our strengths too far. I become
Yeah.
too intense, right? The girls at the RTC said, Dr. Greg, you're so extra. I used to think that was a compliment, right?
Right. Yeah.
I was like, thank you, right? But it didn't mean it as such, right? So emotional intelligence, so personality ran through the machine of emotional intelligence equals our interpersonal and personal effectiveness, right? And that's where a lot of the equipping is. But now number four is spiritual development and destiny. Of course, there's ethics there, but real quick, as far as the meta narrative, the grand story. So Genesis 1, 2, 3, and 4 1 and 2, everything was perfect. Genesis 3, everything went to hell, literally. But if you look at Genesis 4, it says these descendants started becoming shepherds and herdsmen. These descendants started making tools. And then these descendants started making musical instruments. So we know that from Genesis 4 on to today, there's God's and man's response to what happened in Genesis 3. So we know God's response, but man's response is in those three areas. Like shepherds and herdsmen, I liken that unto the formation of foundational society, like city management, government, state running, right? Shepherds are like commodities, right? Then there's tools. So I say that ever, every job ever, and every technological advancement ever is either trying to solve a human problem or enhance the human experience. So musical instruments, because that's what actually like that's interesting. Musical instruments. So trying to increase the experience. So I when I work with people, and I cannot tell you how many middle-aged like guys and gals came to me and they were successful. Like I've actually had two doctors who were making 300K plus a year come to me because like they said, is this it? It's because they were lacking what I call the Iron Man core, you know, that movie, like the inexhaustible energy source. So that's purpose. And when it comes to the purpose, as a matter of fact, in my couples book, I just revised a version of helping our children like tramp a child in the way they should go. That way is moral, of course, but it has to do with observing what the life experiences of our kids, because everybody's purpose, destiny, and calling has always come from life experiences, what we've experienced. And then they look at the world and I say, okay, look at the world and say, man, there's a lot of problems, but there's one thing about the human experience that I cannot stand or would want to change. It's this. And again, some people say poverty or sex trafficking, but at the core, it has to do with where you agree with God is on the negative side. The problem side of it is an eradication of the human soul. It angers God. So that's what I want to change on the negative side. On the positive side, it's like I want to enhance the human experience. Man, we're missing something here. Like Howard Schultz and Starbucks. Matter of fact, when I wrote this book, I was on a cruise with my wife. That is 100% not about problem solving. That is enhancing the human experience. So I find that people just get this vision of I want to change the world in this way. And that's what we're missing because remember, like an Iron Man movie, he had all that high tech shrapnel burning its way to his heart. And that's
Right.
what, so without the Iron Man core, that shrapnel's like life's annoyances. It's traffic, it's weather, it's all that annoying stuff that could kill our hearts literally. But when you have the Iron Man core, it's like it repels that. And it's like, this is what I was born for. Get out of my way. Right and God aligns with you, and that's what energizes you. So that's the mission statement, purpose, destiny, and calling that everybody is at the end of the day. There's got to be something more.
Mhm.
There's got to be something more, right? Besides just the rat face, if you will. That's where it came from.
All right. Well, before our last question that we ask everybody, uh, Greg, where can people find you? Where's the easiest place for them to find you?
So if they can see my name on the Zoom, Dr. Greg Stewart, just take out the period.com. It's DrGregStewart.com, and that's the easiest place to find me. Got
Okay.
my books there and my counseling, coaching, consulting, all that.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And then the last question, like I said, that we ask everybody because the
Yep.
podcast is called Your Best Day Yet. How would you describe that for yourself?
My best day yet in the past was the birth of my grandson 9 months ago. I
All
mean,
right.
there's been lots of wonderful days, but of course, nothing beats the best day yet as far as my grandson being born, because my first book, in writing this book, it's about legacy. So I dedicate to my children, my grandchildren, my great grandchildren. I'm leaving a legacy. So that's my best day yet.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks again for being on. There's a lot we could still
Yep,
unpack, so maybe we'll have you back in the future here.
would love it.
Was good stuff, very inspirational. I appreciate it. If you want more information, folks, you can visit us at centerforvictory.com. And just remember, wherever you're at, whatever you're doing, make this your best day yet. We'll see you soon.